All right. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to part two of my breakdown of American Homeboy. I'll put the link to part one in the bio. Let's get started. So, this is Eduardo Pagan, and he is the author of the book Murder at the Sleepy Lagoon. I highly recommend it. It's a great book if you're interested in this history. But he's just talking a little bit about the American Southwest and the influence that Mexican culture has had on it and how it used to be a part of Mexico. Some of the treaties that were broken in wake of the Mexican American War. So I wanted to illustrate on that point the influence that Mexico also had on our modern cowboy. We sort of have this iconic American image of the cowboy, but cowboys weren't always looked at in a positive light. There was a time when they were looked at negatively. And a lot of Americans don't realize that a lot of the aesthetics that we typically associate with the modern cowboy actually came from Mexico. Now, I know that a lot of people are going to say, no, it came from Spain. And that's true. The cattle herding and some of these other things came from Spain. But the aesthetics that are typically associated with the American cowboy, the chaps and things like that, all came from Mexico. So you can just see some old footage right here of, this negative portrayal of a Mexican attacking some innocent people. And I just thought it'd be funny to splice in this old clip from a movie, and it sort of illustrates the love hate relationship that Americans had of cowboys early on before they became the iconic figure that they are today. So we are in post Mexican American War now, a few decades pass, and we get into the Mexican Revolution. And this is real footage from the Mexican Revolution. Again, we worked with Ford to get a lot of this footage because Ford had plants everywhere and they recorded a lot of different things. And so we got the deed to this footage, like I mentioned in part one. And then we used AI to be able to upscale it and restore it so we could watch it on bigger screens, basically. And a lot of this footage is pretty amazing. But we needed to illustrate, I think, that this sort of wave of immigration that was caused post Mexican American War during the Mexican Revolution, because a lot of people were fleeing the violence and they went all over, but most came to the United States. And that's what led to a lot of neighborhoods that we have today, which you'll see later in the film. But this is just Luis talking a little bit about how he had family members that fled the Mexican War or the Revolution. So both Luis and Denise and Jose are all talking right now about you start seeing these pockets that pop up across the Southwest that were different from before. You see these cities starting to grow and neighborhoods around them kind of peppered around Tucson and El Paso and San Antonio and Los Angeles. And this is where you start seeing your first neighborhoods that a lot of the early gangs would grow out of. And we go into sort of uh, how a lot of the poor people from different ethnicities and races were all sort of pushed to the margins and segregated into these neighborhoods. So I like a lot of this early footage. But what I think is most fascinating is just sort of the mix, right? It wasn't just black or Mexican or even white. You had Russians, you had Jews, you had black people, you had Mexican Americans, you had Irish. Everybody's sort of, they were sharing the same neighborhood in a lot of instances. And the common denominator was that they were all poor, right? It was just poor people that were pushed into these neighborhoods and often sort of on the margins of society. And so you know, these people were racialized in a different way than what we think of today. Typically, when you talk to people, they narrow everything down to skin pigmentation, but it really wasn't like that back in the day. It was looked at a little bit differently. I'm not saying people weren't discriminated against on the basis of race, but there was a lot more to it. And the Irish are a good example, right? The Irish need not apply. Those types of signs were everywhere. So this is Jose just expanding on that idea and sort of that thought that I just said. And these are some of the poor neighborhoods that existed around the US, and this is Jose sort of expanding on that thought as well. Now, this is Luis talking about how, a lot of these sort of gangs and cliques that we think of today didn't start out necessarily with people saying, "Hey, let's start a huge criminal enterprise." it was a lot different than that. It usually started out with sort of neighborhoods and surnames and even football teams, as Gil mentions here. And these sort of evolved. Okay, so now we're getting into the 1950s and World War II, which is right around the corner. And you can see some of the footage here that we use. This is from early Los Angeles. And again, we used AI to upscale all this footage so you could watch it on bigger screens. We had a limited pool of photos that we could draw from. There's a lot of universities that own the rights to all these photos, and a lot of those universities they didn't want to work with us, and or they wanted like $4 or $5,000 for us to use a single photograph. So it was a really frustrating thing. A lot of these universities talk a big game about telling this history, but at the end of the day, they gatekeep a lot of this history. And so I was happy with the universities that did work with us because we were able to put some of this stuff out there, but it wasn't easy. And this is just Luis talking about all the people that migrated over from El Paso over to Los Angeles. And you see the development of this sort of zoot suit culture, which was influenced by black jazz culture at the time. And Mexicans sort of Mexicanized it and made it their own and added their own little twists and turns. But there was some intermingling that happened in those neighborhoods that led to the development of this subculture. So John's talking about the war, everybody going off to war, and you sort of have these zoot suiters hanging behind, and many of them sort of pushed back against, the structure of the time. They were sort of defiant. They did their own thing. They were flamboyant, and a lot of this was perceived as a bit of a threat. Not everybody liked it. There was war rationing at the time. And so it caused a lot of friction between Mexican American communities and the military and the government. So this is Charlie talking a little bit about how the women in particular, many were unorthodox. They had brothers that had gone out to the war and things like that. And a lot of the men had gone to fight in the war. And so there's just sort of this upheaval of traditional Mexican culture that happened during this time. And you're seeing the development of this sort of Mexican American identity that we would come to know and Chicano culture. So I like this part right here because Jose discusses sort of the juxtaposition also, which is that you had zoot suiters in the streets, but you also had some of these same families, even zoot suiters who went and fought in the war. In fact, I'm related to one of them, somebody who was a zoot suitor and who also fought in the war. So that happened. And yes, there were Mexican Americans that were against the war, like any other war. But there were families that were certainly split who maybe had one brother who was a zoot suitor, one that went off to war. And as you see right here, the US government actively marketed toward Mexican American communities to recruit for the war. So a lot of the women stayed behind and worked in the factories. This is just some footage here to illustrate Luis's point. But LA was certainly in a wartime setting at this time, and a lot of their money came from sort of this wartime industry that was happening, spread up and down the West Coast. So I went through a lot of war footage. I have tons and tons and tons of war footage, and I spent a lot of time upscaling this footage so we could watch it. It's crazy to think how far AI has come, even since I made this film 4 years ago, because even now you can do a lot. This is John talking about the juxtaposition of the United States claiming to sort of be this bastion of democracy and freedom, but meanwhile there's internment camps for the Japanese, and then they're suppressing anti-war speech at home, and then of course clashing with Mexican American youth in cities like Los Angeles, Detroit, Houston, San Francisco. And so it is one of the great juxtapositions in our history, and we've seen this throughout history in wartime climates. Uh, in my film, American Homeboy, this is by far the most complex editing that I did. This whole montage, this war sequence that lasts a couple minutes, was a hard montage to edit. I went through a lot of footage to put it together and to make it work. It just, if you're an editor, you can probably see it. It's hard to explain to average people who might not notice these little nuances, but it wasn't easy to edit. And I'm a pretty versed editor. But it was fun to put together. And people often ask me, they're like, Brandon, why did you have this really long war montage in the film? It's almost longer than any other montage that we have in the film. And the reason why is because I wanted to illustrate truly the horrors of war, especially a world war. We've seen little skirmishes and battles and mini wars and on different continents in our lifetime, but most of us have never lived through a world war. And so it's an ugly thing. It's a devastating thing. You see the missiles being dropped on these cities full of innocent people. And I just think that war is really one of those evil things. And at this time, I mean, you have some of the most charismatic leaders in world history, all on the world stage, clashing. You have Mussolini, you have Hitler, you have Churchill. I mean, just all of these guys going at it. So it's pretty amazing time, and this footage kind of represents that. So during the buildup, you have everybody marching off to war, all the planes taking off, and now we're starting to see war happening in real time. The fires, the bombs, the people running, the deaths, and and then we're gonna get the aftermath right here. And this is the quiet after the storm. Entire cities reduced to rubble, uh, whole generations wiped out, people killed. So it's a sad, devastating thing. And my own personal view is that war is evil and that war is a last resort, self defense. But I wanted to illustrate this, I think, for a lot of the younger audience. And I wanted to end this montage with this light shining down sort of from the heavens to sort of illustrate there's always hope. I thought it was a beautiful shot, but that was my objective in editing together that montage. So now we spin into Sleepy Lagoon. And Sleepy Lagoon was one of the many catalysts leading up to the infamous Zoot Suit riots. It happened about a year prior. It wasn't the sole catalyst, but it was one of many catalysts and an important catalyst. And I recommend everybody read the book Murder at Sleepy Lagoon by Eduardo Pagan, who is one of the people speaking here. Him and Jose are sort of going back and forth and sort of cross cutting between them against the backdrop of this montage, telling the story of Jose Diaz, who was, of course, killed during this skirmish and left dead on the side of the road. And that became a flashpoint um, in the lead up to the Zoot Suit riots, but certainly for law enforcement, because as we're going to get into in a moment, when they found Jose Diaz, it set off hysterics all over. And so they did dragnets, started rounding up Mexicans and Mexican Americans across the county. And there were clashes that were happening everywhere. And this was all sort of part of the fuel that led to the modern day Mexican American Cholo, Mexican American culture, all these different subcultures that we see today grew out of these eras and the turmoil of these eras. So Eduardo, I like Eduardo because I think he's one of the more intellectually honest academics that I deal with. And he gave a great rundown of what he thought happened. And you can see some photos here that we have of different zoot suiters and youth being rounded up in different parts of the country. Obviously, predominantly in Los Angeles, but again, there were clashes that happened everywhere. But LA was definitely the epicenter of it all. And you can see there was roughly 500 Mexican American youth right here. You can see this photo that were rounded up because of how they looked. Many were beat up, and it wasn't like they were just complete 100% victims. They were fighting back as well. I mean, these were clashes that were happening. And so it's a fascinating part in time, but a lot of innocent people rounded up. And if it sounds familiar, you know, we've obviously been here before, and it's sort of interesting against the backdrop of what's happening today. Little bit different of circumstance, but it's still nonetheless. Sometimes history repeats itself in certain fashions, and this is Eduardo talking about how if you go back and look at history, there actually wasn't a bump in crime linked to Mexican American zoot suiters, but the perception of an increase in crime existed, and so there was a demand to round them up, and so that's in part what led to what we ended up with. And this sort of fueled what would become sort of Mexican American gangs as we know them today, the criminalization of these youth. And that's Chuco talking right here. So as we get out of the 50s, 40s and 50s, start to go into the 60s, you begin to see that full transformation, right? You have the military, you have labor, you have prison, and the backdrop of this previous era that just all culminate to create the beginnings of the modern day cholo as we know it today. And we sort of big bookends that. So I think we'll leave it here. That's the end of chapter 1 of American Homeboy. Thank you for coming out and joining me. I will be back next week and we'll get into chapter 2 and continue to break down the film and why I made it the way I did, my thoughts behind it. And we'll see you then. Hello, my friends. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on your notifications.